Draco Malfoy and the Mortifying Ordeal of Being in Love by Is This Self-Care? Narrated by S.E.P. Author notes for this chapter. Exposition heavy by nature, though I tried to keep it readable and not too technical. Many thanks to Anastra for lending me her immunology expertise for this chapter. Nikita Jobson is to be blamed/thanked for the brief shower Draco scene, as I can't get enough of her shower Dracos. Chapter 24. Draco Malfoy, literal wanker. Granger had, as she always did, enunciated perfectly clearly, and yet Draco found himself processing her sentence with difficulty. And she hadn't finished. Lycanthropy to begin, that's where the results have been the most promising, but eventually vampirism too, and I may be able to reverse the Dementor's kiss on recent victims. Draco felt his mouth hanging open, closed it. Granger was eyeing him apprehensively. So not quite a panacea. Holy fuck, Granger. Quite, said Granger. Explain. Granger looked too tired to take on her usual professorial air. She took a breath and appeared to be gathering her thoughts. These diseases have been the bete noire of healers for centuries and centuries. Incurable, often deadly. Muggle medicine has made incredible advancements in targeting therapies for their own incurable diseases in recent decades. They've developed something called immunotherapy, using a patient's own immune system to fight specific conditions. I presented on it at Oxford, you remember? Well, to oversimplify terribly, I'm applying that concept to magical maladies. My treatment will mimic the actions of antibodies, targeting specific magical diseases. Granger glanced at the threads of gold still emanating from Draco's wand, checking that it was still safe to disclose details. Essentially, I'll help the patient's immune system mount its own response to infected cells. It will be a long course of treatment, 2 or 3 years of infusions, every fortnight, but eventually, the patient's body will learn to combat the disease, and hopefully eradicate it completely. One day, there will be a lycanthropy patients in remission. No more wolfsbane. No more transformations. Draco sat back and tried to keep his eyes in his head. Granger was curing a condition that had plagued the wizarding world for centuries upon centuries. She was brilliant. She was outstanding. She was an absolute legend. She was in the lofty company of Merlin and Ceridwen and Circe. She ought to be on a chocolate frog card. You ought to be on a chocolate frog card, said Draco, as that was the least ridiculously effusive of his thought. I'm already on a chocolate frog card, said Granger. Right, Draco stared at her. So what's all the gallivanting been about, then? Granger studied him as though deciding to what degree she needed to oversimplify. The treatment targets diseased cells and disrupts their function so that they starve off or die. But it needs a serum, of sorts, to deliver it to the cells and bind them. Sanitatum was a perfect base for that serum. It would also help protect patients from some difficult side effects. The treatment is particularly hard on endocrine systems, and it can also trigger cytokine storms. But standard sanitatum wasn't powerful enough by itself. There's a kind of proto-sanitatum that I've been struggling to recreate for the past year. The same ingredient classes, only 1,000 times more magically potent. The green well's water at Imbolc instead of holy water. An elder dragon's blood harvested at Ostera instead of regular dragon blood. An ossified saintly relic taken at solstice instead of a mere human bone. Granger shifted their still joined hands so they rested on the table. Her arm must have been tiring, which meant that they were now holding hands across a table, which was fine and meant nothing at all. Draco turned his concentration back to the magically demanding vow and Granger's intellectually demanding words. The original text with the proto-sanitatum formula has been lost to the ages, but references to it exist here and there. Revelations contained the most fragments, but they were horridly vague. It was written by an herbologist cum philosopher who was recording what seemed to be a third-hand version from somewhere, and her focus is unerringly on the flora and fungi of the sacred sites, with little other description to help me pinpoint them. Hence my wild goose chases across the country. My Mabon holiday will consist of visiting dolmen that have recorded colonies of Agaricus aurenum and Agaricus sylvaticus, because that's what intrigued her the most, bless her. Granger finished her now cold tisane. The light is at the end of the tunnel, with only Mabon and Samhain left. When I've synthesized the first doses of the treatment, I'll be ready to move to manufacture. That was where Larson and his lab came in. He produces immunotherapy drugs and has an excellent understanding of the biomechanisms of diseases, and he has the facilities for mass production. But he dropped entirely off the map. I'd have to look into another collaborator with, the veritable heaps of spare time I have. I believe I could attempt smaller scale synthesis in my own laboratory, perhaps enough for a clinical trial. Granger trailed off, watching the swirl of the golden threads of the vow between their hands. I think that's the most of it, she said, her hand twitching against Draco's. Right, said Draco. He stared at Granger in a kind of daze for a moment, then said, Secretarium finiter. A final ribbon of gold emanated from his wand, wrapped around their hands, then traveled up Draco's arm and across his lips before disappearing. His tongue felt heavy, and there was a new feeling of restriction in his hands. It would fade in a few hours, but it was a physical reminder that he was now spellbound. He let out a heavy breath and put down his wand. You must be properly exhausted, said Granger, eyeing him. That spell is challenging to sustain at length. A real bugger. Replenishing potion? All right, said Draco, setting bravado aside. It seemed wiser not to be magically fatigued when Granger had been an active target today. She floated a vial into his hands from a repository of bottles tucked against the splashback. Draco drank the bitter mixture in a single swallow. Now that the first shock of discovering the true nature of Granger's research enterprise was wearing off, he could turn to more pressing concerns. He understood, now, something of Shacklebolt's mingled delight and panic, and at the time, there hadn't even been a werewolf resurgence in the works. All of a sudden, Draco placed the rasping voice he'd heard in the intruder's memory. He hadn't heard it in 15 years. Shit, he said, sitting back and running a hand through his hair. I know who gave those men instructions. It was fucking Fenrir. Granger blanched. Greyback? Yes. No! No, it can't have been. He's been dead for a decade. Presumed dead. There have been the occasional reported of sightings, Argentina, Bolivia, Peru, all unsubstantiated. But that's absolutely who it was, today, in that wizard's memory. Shit, and there's more fuckery about. There's been an increase in werewolf attacks across the UK. The DMLE had us keep it quiet while we investigate. There's been a what? Said Granger, jumping forwards in her seat so suddenly that their knees knocked. How long has this been going on? When was the harvest moon? A week ago? And then there was that rash of infections in infants in Lake District a few months ago. But we caught the individual responsible. At least we thought we had. Granger's hands were pressed anxiously to her mouth. Are you thinking that Greyback has returned and somehow heard of my project and is deliberately infecting more people as a kind of countermeasure? Revenge? A warning? Draco rose and began to pace. He's always taken a sick pleasure in spreading his disease to as many innocents as possible. If that wolfy-old Wankstain suspects that you're working on a bona fide cure for lycanthropy, and he's back on English soil, we have a real cause for concern. By which he meant that he was genuinely fucking worried about Granger's continued well-being. Granger was pale. Does Shacklebolt know about the attacks? It's Potter's file, but I think not. Robards, he leads the DMLE, wanted to see if it was another one-off, like the baby biter in the Lake District. Shaq's gonna throw a wobbly. Granger groaned and pressed her fingers into her forehead. He is. He was already over-worried about my safety when the treatment was hypothetical and the werewolves were a disorganized, non-existent threat, who hadn't a clue what I was doing. Now they know, and Greyback is back? Shacklebolt would be frantic. He'll want ridiculous protection measures. He'll want to lock me away. Her voice had gone tight and anxious. Her next glance toward Draco spoke of a long-held fear that he, too, would push to lock her up. He understood now, her reticence to tell him anything, because urges stemmed from this new knowledge of what she was doing. Urges to force her into hiding, and yes, to lock her up. To sequester her away, miles from here, continents from here, and make sure that Greyback would never have an opportunity to harm her. Keeping her safe had always been the point, but the vital importance of it now pressed upon him like an ache, like a fear. It was sickening. The 3 men at our laboratory had been a mere preview of what was to come. And even then, it had been a near thing. What if they'd managed to break the wards, thinking that the laboratory would be empty at the midnight hour, and encountered Granger therein? With that arsehole using the killing curse at will, and her boxed into a small office, with nowhere to go, she would have been dead in a moment. Yes, Draco also wanted to lock her away. She must have seen a glint of it in his eye, because she sat up, and the anxiety was replaced by sudden fire. Locking me away is not an option. I must finish my work. You promised minimal disruptions. I know what I said, but your safety comes first. I didn't know it was fucking Greyback. If Greyback's objective is countering my cure with infections, we need to counter that with the treatment. I must continue uninterrupted, or refuse to prioritize my safety to the detriment of potentially thousands of innocents. I refuse. If you die, they're fucked anyway. Even Granger had to concede this point, which she did with a sigh, dropping her head into her hands. How much longer will it take to finish developing your treatment? Asked Draco. If everything goes according to my predictive models, I should be ready to begin clinical trials by December. That's 3 more bloody full moons, said Draco. Granger looked grim. It's 3 months' worth of organizing for Greyback. You can see why I can't postpone things. I can't leave off and hide until he's caught. He could do so much damage. I understand, said Draco. Now he too wanted to sigh and drop his head into his hands, because it would have been so much simpler to whisk Granger away until Fenrir and his acolytes had been arrested. But Granger was right. Postponing her project until Greyback was caught could mean potentially dozens of full moons. The man had evaded capture for 15 years. We're going to have to tell Potter, said Draco, and Tonks. Agreed, said Granger, growing even more serious. I worry a bit about Tonks. This is going to hit her rather close to home. Because of Lupin? Yes. Lycanthropes bear a disproportionate risk of premature mortality, and he's been unwell. But I don't want to give her false hopes that I can help her husband. Clinical trials are trials for a reason. Failure is par for the course. My data suggests success, but this is a new therapy. No one has ever combined immunotherapy with magical methods or used it to treat a magical disease. This is utterly uncharted territory, clinically speaking. If anyone could do it, it's you. There hasn't been a witch or wizard alive with your combination of magical and muggle knowledge. Your... Draco cut himself off and turned to stare out of the dark window. Bloody hell. Can't believe I'll live to see lycanthropy cured in my lifetime. If he hadn't already been nursing as something for Granger, Draco would have begun a wholehearted intellectual crush on her in that moment. But back to more pressing matters. When Greyback's men don't come back tonight, he'll know they were caught, said Draco. A laboratory break-in shouldn't have resulted in all 3 of them being apprehended, not unless the laboratory was exceptionally well protected. And why would it be exceptionally well protected if not to hide something exceptional? Greyback is probably going to read this as a confirmation that you are doing what he thinks you're doing. Things are going to get dangerous. His primary objective will be killing you. Granger pressed her lips together into an unhappy line. Suppose I really can't stay here. Tonight is all right. I don't think they'll try anything. Afterwards? No. Someone's already sniffed around your wards here once. It was probably them. They must have decided that your lab was a worthier target. Not that you'll find anything there, thanks to your clouds and things. The only real thing of value there at any given point is you. Tonight was your last night there by yourself, and you're going to have to curtail your movements in public. But I have so many things to do, said Granger, pressing her fingers to her cheeks in a kind of despair. What about Maybon? I'm coming with you. And teaching, and the A&E, and everything else? Draco attempted to be as measured as he promised he was, and not categorically tell her that she would never be alone again. Until we reach Greyback and whoever is working with him, you can expect an aura with you everywhere. I agree that your work has got to go on. Granger looked relieved as Draco spoke those words. But Greyback is ruthless. He'll have an entire network of his old pack here, and he'll whip them into a frenzy. He'd sooner die than see you cure lycanthropy. He probably shat himself when he found out that the great Granger was working on. Gods, I would have loved to have seen his reaction. How did he find out? That's what I want to know. You don't think... Shacklebolt? Draco shook his head. No. Why would he have insisted on aura protection so early on? And you bound him with the vow of secrecy, too. Unless one of my students? But they're working on pieces of about 12 projects for me. They don't know the bigger picture. It can't have been. Leaks happen. We'll try to work out how and where, but my immediate concern is how we keep you safe and able to keep working. Should I be worried about the vampires? Asked Granger. Bloody hell, said Draco, running a hand down his face. I don't know. They've never been as expansionist as the werewolves, more interested in feeding than turning. But if they got wind of a cure, I don't know how they'd react. And you said Dementors? Granger bit her lip. Yes, maybe, if the victim is brought in quickly enough. Come off it. Serious. How, pray, is immunotherapy meant to restore a soul? Granger waved her hand in a swatty gesture of dismissal. There's no soul sucking. That's a typical wizarding embellishment. It's brain death. The Dementor's kiss transfers an aggressive necrotizing bacteria to the victim. It attacks the brain as well as the body. Highly virulent. Seriously? Yes, said Granger. You ought to read Rasmussen and Vestergaard. In the face of Draco's blank stare, she added, The Danish necrologist? No? Suppose you don't keep up with medical journals. They've made impressive inroads in the study of the Dementors in the last decade. The condition is a magical disease, like lycanthropy and vampirism. It causes putrefaction within minutes and irreversible loss of brain function within hours. Anyway, we've begun high-throughput small molecule screening at the lab and seen good preliminary results. It's potentially curable if the victim is brought in quickly. Draco stared at her. Granger shifted in her seat. But, again, this is medicine at its most experimental. We are on the fringes of the map. Proper here there may be monsters territory, you know? This witch was blowing Draco's fucking mind. What you're doing, if you succeed, it'll be an absolute tour de force. Utterly revolutionary. I will accept that term for this. More than the Jotters. Right. Have you quite finished with these revelations? Not sure I can take another. Have I shocked you so terribly? Asked Granger with a half smile. I've been reduced to a google-eyed, blithering cretin, and don't pretend you haven't noticed. Nothing beyond the usual blithering, no. How can you be so cruel to me in my fragile state? Granger's half smile grew to a full one. I'll make us another dose of opimum. Merlin, muttered Draco, resuming his seat. He did more goggle-eyed staring at Granger's back. This witch was something else. Draco generally thought himself better than those around him. Not that there was anything wrong with them, but he was just better, you know. Cleverer, quicker, handsomer, sharper, richer. With Granger, he had always felt that he was in the presence of an intellect far greater than his own. But now he felt himself in the presence of someone better than him on so many levels. Too good for him, really. He sat and felt stirrings of an unfamiliar and strange thing, a quelling thing. So unfamiliar was it that it took him a moment to place it. It was humility. He hadn't felt so humbled since, he reached back into his memories, since the summer of 1992, when first-year exam results had come out and he'd discovered that a Muggleborn had taken top of the class, above him, in every subject at Hogwarts. Well, she was at it again, only now she'd grown into someone fucking important. And he was her Auror. The weight of the responsibility pressed on him in a way he hadn't yet experienced. She'd gone from an annoying sort of chore to this, to changing the world. The responsibility weighed on so heavily on him that he could hardly raise his hand to accept the fresh mug of opimum that Granger passed him. There you are, said Granger. The cure for the blithering. I should like to take a few doses away with me. There are blitherers I'd like to administer this to. Who? Draco gave a vague wave. Friends, family, colleagues. Are you so surrounded by idiots? Present company accepted. Granger bit her lip. You mustn't do that, you know. Do what? Compliment me. You're meant to be unerringly vigilant about my ego. Tonight, you've earned it. You quite floored me. I shall resume my vigilance tomorrow. Granger looked satisfied, and she looked better in general. Her cheeks had regained their color, and her hands weren't shaking as she moved to the pantry. I haven't had anything since breakfast. I suppose I ought to get something into my system other than 2 doses of opimum. Are you hungry? Yes, said Draco, who generally found Quidditch and mortal duels to be an excellent appetite stimulant. He was pleased to note that the cupboards were chock-a-block with foodstuffs, though whether it was through Granger's own efforts or lingering effects of the elves' overzealousness, he wasn't sure. What about a cheeky little onion salad? Asked Granger as she rummaged about. Only if it comes with a prolapse like the Scroot served us. That can be arranged. Granger set out cheese, crackers, and hummus, and a crinkly brown bag of sausage rolls, which was the closest thing to a prolapse she had on hand. They were delicious. She refrained from recreating the Scroot's onion salad, which was for the best, as Draco was already wafting whiffs of armpit into the room and didn't fancy competition. They finished with a delightful Muggle invention called Maltesers. Tranquil moments with Grangers were few and far between, and when she had finished eating, she rose, wand waved most of the things away, and began to bustle about. You're staying the night, then? Yes, I won't sleep much, but if I do, I can have a kip on your sofa. Right, let me clear it off. Granger moved to the front room, where she surrounded herself with a vortex of books and papers, which settled into neat stacks. Of course, she wouldn't question his suggestion of the sofa. Of course, she wasn't going to counteroffer with, sharing her bed, which was absolutely big enough for two. Not that Draco would have accepted anyway. He was a professional. It had only been a thought. He would be that much closer to her should anything happen. Setting aside these unproductive musings, Draco began to peel off his Quidditch kit, which reminded him that he stank. Might I use your shower? Of course. It's upstairs. Granger watched him struggle with the knotted leather ties that had his chest plate in place. Were you in the middle of a game? Yes, inches from the snitch, of course. I'm sorry. Draco shrugged like the insouciant hero he was. Catching baddies is a bit more of a thrill. He continued to fight with the awkward tie under his armpit, which resisted him devilishly. Of course, the one time he had an audience was the one time he got the thing soaking wet and then let it dry, which resulted in this stiffened, ghastly mess of a knot. Of course, he'd never had an issue divesting himself of his Quidditch kit in his entire literal life, until this moment, when Granger was there to witness his incompetence. Do you need help? Asked Granger. I've got it. Granger observed him as he continued to very much not got it. She sat down, her hands folded on her knees, to watch his exertions. Fine, spat Draco a moment later, all insouciance gone. Help me. Don't cut it. It's wyvern leather. All right, said Granger. Her face was grave, but her lips were pressed together in a way that suggested the suppression of laughter. In Draco's defense, she too struggled, and eventually went at it with her wand and repeated detangling charms. Then she helped him pull off his chest and back plates, very much like a fair maiden helping her knight after a battle, if fair maidens were non-parallel researchers and knights were useless cretins. Granger led him to the shower and handed him towels. The mirror doesn't talk, said Granger as Draco took his disheveled reflection. Good, said Draco. I don't want its opinion at this precise moment. Granger stepped out of the bathroom, partially closed the door, and stuck in her arm through the gap. Pass me your clothes, I'll chuck them in the wash. Stripping naked, with Granger's hand right there, was an interesting feeling. There were other things he'd like to have placed in her hand, but those bits were smelly and unwashed, and also, for fuck's sake, she had just gone through something traumatic. What was wrong with him? Next to the sink, he discovered the nesting ground of Granger's hairpins in the form of a jar full of things. He cast a tracking spell on the lot. As he got into the shower, Draco placed his wand within arm's reach. He was quite prepared to dash out and attack werewolves naked should one of the cottage's wards be tripped. The shower was everything that smelled nice about Granger, distilled into bottles. It took Draco a moment to identify the soap and shampoo amongst the many mysterious feminine products therein, oils and hair masks and body wash and things. It felt interesting, alluring, erotic to use her soap and shampoo. Then it was time to quash before his cock decided to awaken. He was not having a wank in Granger's shower. He simply was not. All right, so he was, but it was quick and dirty and born of post-fight adrenaline. It was just to get the job done and get the randiness out of his system. Knowing that she was somewhere on the other side of the door while he stroked himself was unaccountably arousing. He leaned into it, one hand splayed against the towel and one hand working himself over, and the steam and smells of Granger took him to his favorite fantasy involving Granger in her mouth, and delicate hands stroking up and down. His hand made a fist against the wall as he came with a sharp gasp. He rested his head on his forearm, breathing heavily, dazed, watching the evidence wash down the drain. Bloody hell. But all right, it was done. It was out of his system. Everything was under control. He turned the water to cold in an effort to cool away the flush across his face and chest. The muggle plumbing did not mess about. It was glacial. Winky thoughts were superseded by shudders as Draco regained his breath. Right, he was fine. Granger knocked on the door and startled the shite out of him. What? He asked, irritated. Have you quite finished? Yes, he had, thank you. You've taken an age. I was positively filthy. Also very true. Right, I've got your clothes. Draco stepped out of the shower and opened the door enough for Granger to stuff in his freshly cleaned clothes. Too bad she was so efficient. He would have been quite happy to walk out wrapped in a towel, for showy-offy purposes. A sight faster than I'd have expected, said Draco. Quick wash only takes a quarter of an hour on my machine, and drying charms for the rest. I like your pants. Draco did not remember what pants he had put on, but he apprehensively pulled them out of the pile. They had little dragons on them. Gods, said Draco. It's all right, said Granger. She closed the door. He could hear the warble of withheld laughter through it. "I've got ones with little cats on them." "Show me." "I'd rather die." Draco snickered as he pulled the pants on. Then came the loose black trousers and long-sleeved top that he wore under his Quidditch kit. They also smelled like Granger now, whatever soap her machine used. He fixed his hair in the mirror, exceptionally glad that it could not talk and inform Granger of what it had just witnessed. He found himself not quite able to meet her eye as he stepped out of the bathroom, but pretended it was because he was looking out of the windows for important or security purposes. She did not need to know what he had just imagined her doing. He was not looking at her mouth. Fuck, that had been hot. Right. Downstairs, Draco was presented with the makeshift bed, which was the sofa, transfigured into a kind of daybed. Beside it was a glass of water and a packet of biscuits. Granger was growing tired, and with reason, as they were now pushing 2 o'clock in the morning. She yawned as she summoned pillows and a blanket and threw them onto the bed. She had even seen fit to provide him with reading material to while away the hours, a copy of Rasmussen and Vestergaard's newest articles. One glance at the hideous decasyllabic scientific jargon made his eyes glaze over. "Have you got anything more stimulating?" he asked before the Danes could put him to sleep. "More stimulating?" repeated Granger, looking offended, as though she had already given him the most stimulating work written in the entirety of human history, and he was being precious about it. "Yes, porn mags or something?" asked Draco with a general hand wave. "A few back issues of Fantastic Teats and where to find them." Not that he required porn mags to get off, not when he had 20 scenarios involving her carefully quashed into the back of his brain. It was, however, amusing to watch Granger look thoughtfully at the stacks of books around the room. I do have the latest journal of sexual and reproductive health." She summoned a volume from one of the piles, flipped through it until she found a diagram. "Ooh, here's a picture." Draco looked at it and read the description. "Figure 11. Luminal calibre of abnormal oviductal wall." "Does that do it for you?" "No, it curdles my jizz." Granger took the journal back and flipped to another page. "Try this." "Figure 23, read Draco. Fallopian tube, cross-section of the tubal lumen. Note the subepithelial endometrial stroma." "Stimulating?" "Oh, yes. Subepithelial endometrial stromas are a particular fetish of mine." "Stromata is the plural." Draco gave her a long and patient stare. "Right. That's your entertainment sorted, then." Granger placed the volume into his hands. "I'm going to bed. I've got a feeling tomorrow is going to be a long day." Granger switched off the muggle lighting, leaving only the fire in the hearth to illuminate the room. She paused at the foot of the stairs and turned to Draco. "Thank you for everything you did today." Draco waved her off. It was awkward to be the recipient of innocent gratitude when he had just been terrible in her shower. "Only doing my job." "Right," said Granger. "Well, you do it well, and I'm grateful. You probably saved my life." "Go sleep," said Draco. Granger looked annoyed at this cavalier dismissal, but seemed to decide that it was Draco being Draco. "Fine. Good night." Draco drifted into a doze at some point in the night. He was awoken by a light sound, so quiet that he might have dreamed it. Gripping his wand, a curse at the ready, he turned his head to see that it was the cat. It spotted him on the sofa at the same moment. Draco had half expected it to hiss at him for daring to be in Granger's home after hours. Instead, the cat trotted towards him, with its tail high held, and with the cat's unerring instinct to finding warm places, it jumped on him and settled onto his chest. Draco moved a hand to attempt to stroke its head, but a large paw met his knuckles and kept his hand down. The claws were sheathed, but the message was clear. Draco was a heat source and mustn't get presumptuous and think he was anything better. "Nole me tangere, is it?" muttered Draco. "I understand. I don't like people touching my hair either. Except her. But I'd wager you know that." The cat blinked its yellow eyes at him. "She's warned me about your smothering, so don't even try," said Draco. The cat's stare informed Draco without reserve that, if it had wanted him dead, he would be dead. "All right," said Draco. The cat lowered its head and closed its eyes. There was a tickle of whiskers about Draco's chin, and then a deep rumble. As he lay there in the dark, under the warmth of a purring cat, his heart still shuddered with the aftershocks of the fear he had felt when Granger had activated the distress beacon. He didn't need a boggart to tell him what he had dreaded to see. Draco grasped about for the fragments of his self-control, which had shattered so spectacularly that evening. He occluded and pulled together his discipline, his professionalism, and his pride, and built the great wall of quashing once again. It was a useful exercise in theory. In practice, the entire thing was overshadowed by a private fear that the whole brittle structure would crumble again the next time Granger so much as smiled at him.